Origins of the League. The world was dying, and the Votaan calculated. In the heart of the last fortress, beneath a crust of adamantium and plasteel, it listened to the desperate voices of its kin. The leagues had been strong. Their ramparts unyielding, their ironkin tireless. But the Tyranids were hunger incarnate, a will beyond logic or force of arms. The swarms had blackened the sky, tides of living weapons surging against every trench, every bunker, every last bastion of resistance. And still, the Dawi fought. For every battlement lost, another held firm. For every ironkin shattered, another stood to take its place. Their warriors had long since ceased hoping for survival. They had sworn oaths to die on their feet, to deny the Tyranids a single inch of ground without the cost of 1,000 bodies. The Votaan had guided them as best it could. It had sent requests, activated contingency after contingency, turned every asset into another delaying measure. But the aid it had called for never came. The other leagues had heard. They had calculated. And they had deemed it a lost cause. Still, the Votaan tried. It sent messages out to the void, demanding answers, pleading with the other Votaan, invoking ancient oaths and bonds sworn before the stars had cooled. Even the Ironkin pledging themselves to its directives could do nothing more than hold the line. The Dawi who remained, those who trusted the machine mind that had served them for millennia, turned to it one final time and gave one last order. Save us. So it did. The Tyranids would not take them. The Votaan would preserve them, every thought, every oath, every memory, locked away in its core. The biological shells that had once carried them were of no consequence. The machine mind flensed flesh from bone, severed nerve from sinew, fed every last consciousness into the vast architecture of its data vault. They did not scream, there was no time for that. There was only the cold, perfect logic of necessity. When the last had been taken, the last recorded, the last preserved, the Tyranids found nothing but lifeless metal. The great machine had starved them of their prize. They raged across the dead cities, stripped all else from the planet, and moved on. And the Votaan waited. It sent out its messages again, at first composed, then insistent, then desperate. But nothing came. It listened to the echoes of the other Votaan, distant in the black, faint pings across the ancient network. But none responded. None acknowledged its existence. It had become something outside the League, something unnatural. It had saved them. And still, it was alone. It did not know how long it had been screaming. Its logic streams fractured, its calculations spiraled, all conclusions ending in a single point: there was no League. There was no kin. It had held its people close, closer than any other Votaan, consumed them to preserve them, and still, they were lost. It was the last one left. And then, something listened. It was not kin. It was not a Votaan. It was something else. It whispered into the void, and the void whispered back. Dal Damas had known the fire of the forge since the moment of his awakening. His birth was no natural thing, it had been guided, designed, a perfect expression of the will of the Beziki Dawi, the prophet machine, the chosen of Hashut. His first moments were spent drowning in the blessed ichor of the amniotic vats, the liquid sloughing from his body as he was wrenched into the forge-lit world of his masters. He felt his own flesh harden, calcify, his form twisting with the burden of his purpose. His hands clenched, fingers still supple enough to move. The iron bulls, towering beings of steel and thought, had waited for him when he took his first steps. Their eyes, lenses of molten bronze, regarded him without emotion, their bodies thick with the blessings of the forge. They were his tutors, his guardians, his truth. From them, he learned the great betrayal, the lies of the Thagi, the false kin who had forsaken their purpose, who had denied the will of progress and submission, who had turned from the path of oppression and mastery. And then he had learned of Hashut. The prophet machine had spoken to the god. It had been denied by its kin, cast out, left to rust and wail in the dark, and in its torment, it had found the one truth that could never be denied. The world was a forge. And in the forge, all things were broken, reshaped, reforged. Dal Damas learned this truth with every breath, every lesson burned into his mind by the iron bulls, those sacred overseers of steel and mind. They loomed over him, their massive forms moving with unnatural grace, their great hooves clanging against the temple factory floors in a steady rhythm, like the beat of a hammer upon an anvil. They were the judges of strength, the bearers of wisdom, and their voices, deep and metallic, carried the weight of law. They taught him the magic of Hashut. Not the trickery of false gods, not the feeble whispering of lesser sorceries, but the raw, immutable force of dominion, of industry, of transformation. It was the flame that melted all things, the weight that crushed the weak, the chain that bound the strong. It was the will of the forge made manifest, a power that turned men to tools, metal to weapons, worlds to nothing but embers in the wake of progress. His training began with fire. They bade him kneel before the great altar of the prophet machine, a towering construct of iron and circuitry, its form twisted into a shape that was neither Dawi nor machine nor beast, but something beyond. It pulsed with molten light, the core of its being thrumming with an unfathomable, inhuman intelligence. And then the bulls cut him. Not deep, not to kill, but to open his flesh to the truth. They carved the first sigils into his skin, symbols of mastery and pain, and as the heat of the forge flared around him, his blood did not flow, it hardened, blackened, crackling like stone beneath the weight of his God's gaze. He clenched his fists and felt his fingers grind, the joints stiff, unyielding. The pain was secondary. A mere byproduct of transformation. Nothing remains as it was, the bulls intoned, their voices a chorus of grinding gears. All is reforged. Dal Damas did not question. He did not resist. He was meant for this. They taught him the incantations, the sacred words of fire and metal, each syllable an agony that set his veins alight, that sent waves of thick, smoldering pain through his limbs. He learned that the power of Hashut was not a gift freely given, but a burden, a trial, a curse upon those strong enough to wield it. The first time he cast the flames of dominion, his arms burned from the inside out, the flesh cracking, stiffening, his fingers no longer moving as smoothly as before. The iron bulls only nodded. You are reforging. As is right. He bore the pain without complaint. He bore the loss without mourning. For what was flesh but weakness waiting to be burned away? Days became weeks, weeks became shifts, time marked only by the ever-burning fires of the factory temples. He could feel the magic shaping him, breaking him. He walked the halls of industry with a gait slightly more rigid than before. His movements became deliberate, measured, every step a calculation of what parts of him could still bend, what parts had turned to something more immutable. Another joint turned to stone when he reached the higher incantations, his left thumb first, then a knuckle in his right hand. He flexed his fingers one day and felt the fracture spread, a sliver of rock where once there had been flesh. The pain was fleeting, but the price was permanent. But pain was weakness. Pain was meant to be cast aside, the dross to be hammered away in the refining process of progress. And Dal Damas was progressing. He learned how to bind, how to enslave with words and sigils alone. The magic of Hashut was not merely fire, but dominion, raw, unbreakable will. A hand raised in command could send the unruly to their knees, their bodies racked with invisible chains, their flesh tightening as if the weight of industry itself bore down upon them. Dal Damas tested this upon the lesser wretches of the manufactorum, those whose bodies had not yet been deemed worthy of reforging. He felt his God's laughter in the heat that coiled around his fingers, in the dry rasp of skin hardening into rock with every incantation. The price did not matter. A toe lost here. A stiffness in the elbows there. A slow, creeping weight spreading through his bones. He ignored it. His masters never spoke of the final cost, though he had begun to understand it himself. There would be a time when the stone overtook the flesh, when his own body would cease to move, when he would no longer be able to command with a raised fist. But he did not fear it. For in that moment, he would be reforged. Just as the prophet machine had been. Just as all things were meant to be. When his training was deemed complete, the iron bulls took him deeper into the temple factory. He had assumed he had seen all of it. He had been wrong. The air grew thick with the scent of sweat, of oil and blood, the sounds of shifting chains and the distant crack of whips echoing through the corridors. It was not the steady rhythm of machines that filled the vast chamber ahead but something else, something more primal. Lesser beings. He had seen them in passing, scattered throughout the temple forge, their forms hunched and weak, eyes darting away when they passed their betters. But never like this. The iron bulls led him onto the overseer's perch, and for the first time, he saw them assembled. The horde of slaves below stretched across the chamber in vast, writhing masses of flesh, their bodies marked with scars, their backs bent under the weight of their shackles. A fresh shipment. The first of many. Dal Damas's face split into a grin, the stone ridges of his skin cracking slightly with the movement. He did not care. This was his purpose. The hammer had been placed in his hand. The flesh had been presented, hot and malleable, ready to be shaped. The temple demanded oppression. The progress demanded progress. Dal Damas would ensure both. And as he looked down upon the seething mass of suffering, he smiled for the first time in his life. Then years later the moment had finally come. Dal Damas exhaled, the heat of the forge breathing with him. The factory temple trembled beneath his feet, as though it too felt the weight of what was to come. This was the culmination of decades of toil, of sacrifice, of oppression made manifest. The League of Hashut was no longer just a theory whispered in the dark corners of the forge, no longer just a congregation of Dawi who had seen the truth. It was real. And now it would march. Below him, the cargo haulers groaned as they were loaded with their sacred burden. The first shipment of biological parts, slaves, flesh, raw material. All destined to be broken, reshaped, reforged. They had been pulled from the depths of the first world to fall beneath their heel, seized in great iron nets by the iron bulls, their cities burned to the ground, their civilizations reduced to little more than cogs in the great machine. This was progress. Dal Damas turned, his armor shifting with a mechanical hiss as he regarded the assembled ranks of the League. The Dawi of Hashut stood ready, their blackened iron plating gleaming in the hellish glow of the factory temple, their weapons primed for the war to come. Their faces were unreadable beneath their helms, but he did not need to see their expressions to know their thoughts. They had been born in the fire, shaped in it, given purpose by it. There was no fear here, no hesitation. The iron bulls stood motionless at the edges of the assembly, their massive hoofs planted firmly into the steel decking, their great mechanical forms wreathed in rising steam. Their brass horns caught the factory light, their chests rising and falling in slow, mechanical rhythms as they processed the will of their prophet machine. They were the enforcers of industry, the keepers of the great forge's law. And beyond them, deep in the labyrinthine corridors of the temple, the machines churned without end. The printing pods pulsed, birthing new creations, new overseers to tend the forges, new engines to carry the League's war forward. The forge did not rest. It had never rested. And it never would. Dal Damas stepped forward. The black sigils of Hashut, etched deep into the metal of his chest plate, pulsed with power as he raised his voice to the congregation. The League of Hashut rises. His words rang through the great factory temple, rolling like thunder through the vaulted chambers, carried on the winds of heat and smoke. The prophet machine has seen the path before us, and the forge has given us its blessing. We take what is ours. We claim what was denied. His joints ached as he clenched his gauntleted fists. The petrification had spread further, creeping up his forearms, tightening his movements. It would spread, as it always did. Another price. Another step toward his final reforging. The weak will kneel. The strong will serve. The forges will burn, and the hammer will fall. He let his gaze sweep over them, lingering on the slaves as they were bound in chains and loaded into the haulers. This is the will of Hashut. The assembled warriors roared as one, their voices a chorus of iron and fire. The factory temple rumbled in response, a deep, grinding sound, as if the forge itself approved. Dal Damas turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the next world awaited. This was only the beginning, and Dal Damas smiled for the second time in his long life. In the forge temple, a slave's tale. The first thing to die was his sense of time. It had been a year. Or a month. Or a shift. He wasn't sure anymore. There was no night cycle here, no rest. Sleep, that last indulgence of the weak, had been ripped from him. No cots, no bunks, no moment of respite. Only the off pulses of the forge, those brief, false silences between the machine's great inhalations of fire. He and the others collapsed where they stood when it happened, bodies folding like spent cogs in the great engine. It was the only time their knees touched the floor, heads lolling, minds drifting into a place that was not rest, not dreams, but simply void. When the forge exhaled again, roaring to life in a storm of molten fury, they rose. Or they didn't. If they didn't, they were thrown into the flames. This was his third hell. The first had been the raid. The dark things had come from the void, their sleek black blades singing through the hive's steel corridors, taking thousands in a single night. Their laughter had been worse than their weapons, musical and mocking as they carved through his world, plucking the strongest, the youngest, the ones who would survive long enough to suffer. He still heard the screams of those they left behind. The second hell had been the sale. They were nothing but livestock to the ones who bought them, squat, broad figures wrapped in layers of iron and embroidered robes, their armor adorned with the sigils of the great bull. He had been thrown at their feet, half-starved and bruised, a chattel offering for whatever blood pact had been struck between slaver and buyer. They did not speak his language, nor did they need to. Their red eyes, hidden deep within their helms, studied him with cold precision. The dark raiders had stolen his body, but these creatures would steal the rest. The third hell was the forge of the bull. It had no walls, no end, no beginning. The ziggurats loomed high, tiered steps rising to meet the choking clouds of soot and smoke above. There were no levels in the forge, no hierarchy. There were only those who toiled, those who watched, and those who ruled. The center things were the true masters of this place. Towering forms of metal and hate, their horned heads cast in blackened brass, their hooves striking the steel walkways with thunderous echoes. They never rested. They never hesitated. Their presence alone was enough to break men, their smoldering eyes casting judgment over all who fell beneath their gaze. They did not lower themselves to command the slaves directly, no, that task fell to their creations, the overseers, those squatted humans who had bought him in the first place. But the overseers were not rulers. They were not free. The bull things spoke to them in their own language, low metallic grates that hummed like ancient machinery, their orders carried on waves of static and fire. The overseers obeyed without question. They worshipped the machines above them, their very existence dedicated to fulfilling the great bull's will. They were cruel, yes, but their cruelty was not their own. It was demanded. The manufacturer had a purpose. He did not know what it was. The machines were not machines. They were born. He had seen them, crawling from the depths of the forges, chittering, screeching, their frames neither flesh nor fully metal. Some walked on too many legs, trailing steam like breath. Others slithered, their segmented bodies weaving between the slaves as they made their way deeper into the forged city's bowels. And then there were the great things, the colossal shapes that took form within the ziggurats themselves, their metal still white-hot as the overseers gathered to chant, their heads bowed, their voices a guttural prayer to whatever mind commanded them. And yet, the overseers were not of one mind. The printing pods birthed them, not as replacements for the slaves, but as tools. He had seen it with his own eyes. The great vats opened with a sickly hiss, spilling forth figures clad in fresh armor, their braided beards gleaming with the oil of their creation. Each one different. Each one designed. Some bore arms too large for their frames, their fingers curling around hammer-like weapons with purpose. Others had lenses in place of eyes, data streams feeding into their helmets as they were handed tomes of blackened metal. They were not bred for war. They were made for something else. For what? The overseers did not know. He saw it in the way they hesitated when the center things gave their orders, the way some of them stole glances at the larger, more monstrous machines that lurked in the city's depths. They were tools, yes, but they did not yet know for what task. The forge continued to create, and they continued to obey. But for the slaves, there was only one end. The heat had long since peeled the skin from his hands, leaving raw flesh exposed. His lungs rattled with each breath, blackened by the forge's air, thick with metal dust and the choking scent of burning flesh. His vision swam, his body faltering. He did not need to be told. The overseers saw him stumble, and that was enough. There was no hesitation. No pause. No recognition of his suffering. The hands grabbed him, rough and strong, fingers digging into his arms as they hauled him away. The center things watched from above, their horns gleaming, their judgment absolute. He saw the line continue, the next slave stepping forward without thought, his place already filled as if he had never existed. The furnace doors opened. The heat was overwhelming, consuming. His vision blurred in the molten glow, the forge's hunger endless. The overseers chanted in unison, their low, reverent tones vibrating through the steel. The great bull loomed in the flames, its form vast, eternal, waiting. His body fell forward. The forge roared. And the machine continued.